Before the potato ruled European tables, there was another root that kept people alive through brutal winters, bad soil, and hard times. It was sweeter, tougher, and way more versatile than you'd expect. And today, almost no one grows it. Number 1. The forgotten king of roots. Long before potatoes became the darlings of European kitchens, parsnips ruled the fields and the dinner plates. In medieval times, this pale, carrot-like root vegetable wasn't just another crop. It was essential. Parsnips were a staple in nearly every village, from peasant farms to monastic gardens. What made them so beloved was their sheer resilience. Unlike many vegetables that needed careful tending, rich soil, or mild weather, parsnips thrived in conditions that would send other crops straight to the compost heap. Freezing winters, rocky or nutrient-poor land. They didn't flinch. In fact, a good hard frost actually made them sweeter, turning their starches into natural sugars. This made them a reliable and surprisingly tasty food source during the coldest, hardest months of the year. In the Middle Ages, farming wasn't exactly a luxury business. Fields were rough, tools were basic, and fertilizers as we know them didn't exist. Yet the parsnip found its way into nearly every medieval diet. When food ran short, as it often did, this root veggie was a lifeline. A medium parsnip delivers about 100 calories, which added up fast when eaten in bulk. But it wasn't just about the calories. Parsnips also offered crucial vitamins and minerals, especially vitamin C, which helped fend off illnesses like scurvy when fresh produce was scarce. The potassium in parsnips supported muscle function, which was a big deal for people doing hard labor daily. Culinarily, the parsnip was a medieval multi-tool. It could be mashed just like a potato, roasted with meat, tossed into stews, or even used in sweet dishes thanks to its sugary kick after a frost. When refined sugar wasn't widely available, parsnips stepped in to sweeten pies, porridges, and baked goods. Some cooks even used parsnip mash as a filling or thickener for cakes and tarts. It was cheap, versatile, and satisfying. Everything a medieval cook could want. Parsnips weren't just practical, they were also valued. They show up in medieval tax records where farmers were often required to give a portion of their parsnip harvest to their lords or the local church. That's a big indicator of how central this vegetable was. If something ends up in your taxes, it's not just a side dish, it's a pillar of the economy. Monasteries across Europe cultivated large plots of parsnips, especially to feed the sick, the poor, and travelers. They knew that having a stash of this tough little root meant food security. Storage was another bonus. Before refrigeration, keeping food fresh was tricky, but parsnips offered a clever solution. You didn't have to harvest them all at once. You could leave them in the ground and pull them out when needed, even in the middle of winter. This low-maintenance storage method meant less spoilage and more reliable meals throughout the year. In every way that counted, nutrition, durability, ease of use, the parsnip was a quiet hero of medieval life. Number 2. The original power grain. Let's talk about emmer wheat, one of the oldest cultivated grains known to humans, and an absolute powerhouse in medieval Europe. Emmer, also known as farro in some parts today, wasn't just some background cereal, it was the backbone of the medieval diet, especially before modern wheat varieties took over. What made it so essential was its incredible resilience. Unlike today's high-maintenance crops, emmer could thrive in tough conditions: rocky soil, minimal rainfall, and barely any fertilizer. Medieval farming tools were crude and the soil quality was often poor, but emmer didn't seem to care. It kept growing season after season when other crops might have failed. Nutritionally, emmer was a beast. It had roughly 30% more protein than today's standard wheat, which is a big deal when you're talking about a time when meat was rare and diets were heavy on grain. On top of that, it was rich in essential minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium. Things people really needed to stay strong, especially when most of the population was engaged in hard physical labor, whether working in fields, building roads, or hauling stone for churches and castles. A single serving of emmer-based bread could go a long way in keeping someone full and energized through a long, cold day. But this wasn't the fluffy, soft bread we think of today. Emmer bread was dense, dark, and heavy. In fact, it was so filling that one slice could serve as a meal. You can forget about slicing into a light ciabatta roll. This was more like a bread brick. And people didn't just eat it, they paid with it. Emmer was so central to life that it became a form of currency. Instead of handing over coins, peasants would pay their dues to landowners in sacks of grain. It was reliable, storable, and had real value. The downside: it was tough to process. Unlike modern wheat that sheds its husk easily, emmer clings to its outer shell. That made threshing and milling more labor-intensive, which eventually became a problem as more efficient grains came onto the scene. With the rise of industrial farming, emmer's stubborn husk made it less attractive for the large-scale processing, and it slowly faded into obscurity. Still in its prime, emmer wheat was indispensable. It provided the calories that fueled everyday life in medieval Europe. For centuries, it was what people survived on, not just in times of feast, but especially during lean seasons. It might not have looked fancy, and it certainly wasn't easy to deal with, but emmer was dependable. That kind of reliability in a world full of uncertainty made it a true staple. The original power grain that built the Middle Ages from the ground up. Number 3, the mussel bean. In medieval Europe, broad beans, also known as fava beans, weren't just a side dish. They were a cornerstone of daily nutrition and agriculture, a true superfood of the time. While today we associate protein with meat, cheese, or expensive supplements, back then the humble broad bean quietly carried the weight of feeding an entire continent. Rich in plant-based protein, fiber, iron, magnesium, and B vitamins, these beans were a nutritional powerhouse for both peasants and nobles. They were one of the few foods that transcended social classes. Excavations of medieval latrines and trash pits reveal broad bean remains from the homes of farmers to the halls of royalty. It wasn't just availability, it was necessity. Unlike meat, which was expensive and often scarce for the poor, beans were easy to grow, store, and prepare. You could dry them and keep them for months, then just soak and boil when needed. For people who didn't have refrigeration or even regular access to fresh food, that kind of shelf stability was critical. Agriculturally, broad beans were just as valuable. They were one of the earliest crops used in crop rotation systems. Thanks to a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their root nodules, these beans naturally fixed nitrogen in the soil. In simple terms, they made the ground richer just by growing there. Farmers noticed that fields planted with beans one season produced better yields the next season, even if they didn't understand the science. This was especially useful in the Middle Ages when chemical fertilizers didn't exist, and soil exhaustion was a real problem. Protein-wise, broad beans were incredibly efficient. 1 hectare of fava beans could produce nearly 700 kilograms of dry beans, translating to more than 200 kilograms of pure protein. Compare that to animal farming, which required far more land, feed, and labor to produce the same nutritional output. In some regions, especially in England and France, growing beans was not just encouraged, it was required by law. Some local governments even enforced regulations mandating that beans be planted in every household garden. That speaks volumes about how crucial they were. In the kitchen, they were nothing if not versatile. Fresh young beans could be eaten raw, straight from the pod. Dried beans were typically soaked overnight, then simmered into soups, stews, or thick porridges. People mashed them into patties and pan-fried them in oil, basically an early version of the veggie burger. During fasting periods such as Lent, when eating meat was forbidden, monks and lay people alike leaned hard on beans for their daily protein intake. They filled bellies and kept workers strong enough to plow fields or build massive stone cathedrals. However, not everyone could tolerate them. Some people, especially those of Mediterranean descent, suffered from a condition known today as G6PD deficiency, or favism, which made eating fava beans dangerous. But even that didn't diminish their popularity. The benefits were too great and the alternatives too few. Number 4, the quick fix crop. Let's talk buckwheat, a plant with a name that confuses a lot of people. Despite wheat in the name, it has nothing to do with actual wheat. In fact, it's not even a grain in the traditional sense. It comes from a completely different plant family, more closely related to rhubarb than to wheat or barley. But in the Middle Ages, people didn't care what family tree it came from. What mattered was how reliable it was. Buckwheat was the crop you turned to when everything else failed. It had this amazing ability to grow fast, like really fast. From seed to harvest, you were looking at just 10 to 12 weeks. That made it perfect for plugging the gap between main crops. If your spring wheat didn't pan out, or the harvest was delayed by bad weather, buckwheat was your safety net. It was kind of like the instant noodles of medieval agriculture, fast, filling, and always there when you needed it. What really made it stand out was its resilience. Buckwheat didn't need rich, fluffy soil or careful irrigation. It laughed in the face of rocky fields and sour, nutrient-poor ground. Farmers could scatter seeds on land most crops wouldn't touch, and within a couple months they had a harvest. That made it a huge deal for small villages or communities hit by tough growing conditions. It also worked beautifully as a rotation crop. Since it grew so quickly, it could be planted between the bigger, more demanding crops like wheat or barley, helping to keep the land productive all year long. But buckwheat wasn't just easy to grow, it was surprisingly nutritious. It offered all 8 essential amino acids, which made it a complete protein. That's rare for a plant. It was rich in fiber and loaded with antioxidants too. This made it ideal for hardworking people who needed real fuel for their bodies. Think of it as the original gym food, minus the branding. Whether you were building walls, tending fields, or dragging stones for a cathedral, buckwheat could help keep you going. In the kitchen, it was just as flexible. People cooked it in a thick porridge, baked it into rustic pancakes, and even brewed it into a kind of dark, heavy beer. That beer might not have won any awards for taste, but it provided calories and hydration when clean water wasn't always an option. For a lot of people, it was a dependable daily staple. One more bonus. Buckwheat helped the land. Its dense growth smothered weeds, and its roots released acids that made soil nutrients like phosphorus more available to future crops. Even if medieval farmers didn't understand the science, they saw the results. Crops planted after buckwheat often grew better. So why did it fall out of favor? Simple. Industrial farming. As agriculture got more focused on high yields and long shelf life, buckwheat's free-spirited, fast-growing nature didn't fit the system. But back then, it was a quiet hero, stepping in when things got rough. And it still got a lot to offer today. Number 5. The green that wouldn't die. Good King Henry was the kind of plant medieval folks relied on when everything else failed. Think of it as the rugged, winter-proof cousin of spinach. Stubborn, tough, and completely underrated. In a time when people didn't have grocery stores or vitamin supplements, this leafy green stepped in as a quiet hero. It grew where others wouldn't, especially around homes and courtyards and along fence lines. Nobody bothered with planting it in nice, tidy rows. You just scatter a few seeds or let nature handle it, and like clockwork, it came back every spring. No tools, no maintenance, no fuss. What made Good King Henry so valuable was its timing. Right at the end of winter, when food stores were running low and people were scraping the bottom of the barrel, this plant started pushing out tender shoots. Those early greens could be cooked like asparagus, offering a fresh bite of flavor and, more importantly, nutrition when bodies were running on empty. Later, the leaves grew bigger and hardier, ideal for soups, stews, and pies. They even got added to pottage, the all-purpose medieval meal made from whatever was on hand. Some resourceful cooks would dry or wilt the leaves to preserve them, and during particularly lean times the seeds were collected, ground, and mixed into flour to stretch bread recipes. Nothing went to waste. Nutritionally, Good King Henry was a powerhouse. It had loads of vitamin A, which helped with vision and immune defense, and vitamin C, which was essential for preventing scurvy, a real concern during long, dark winters. It also packed iron, calcium, and potassium. These weren't bonus features. They were vital when the average diet relied so heavily on grains and preserved foods. The plant's ability to deliver all that in the harshest seasons made it more than just useful. It made it essential. It was the reason some families made it through rough patches of famine or crop failure. Unlike modern crops, which are bred for size, shelf life, and appearance, Good King Henry didn't care about looking pretty. It wasn't marketable in today's supermarket standards. Its leaves were thick, slightly bitter, and didn't store well once picked. That might explain why it started vanishing by the 19th century when agriculture began focusing on mass production and visual appeal. But for centuries before that shift, it was a dependable food source for everyone from poor villagers to monastery gardens. It didn't just grow, it came back year after year like clockwork. That kind of self-sufficiency made Good King Henry a living insurance policy for medieval households. Today, it's mostly forgotten, hiding in the wild or popping up in permaculture gardens. But back then, it was one of the few things standing between people and real hunger when the snow hadn't melted and the pantry was bare. Number 6, the medieval MVP grain. Barley wasn't just another crop in the medieval world. It was the crop. People called it the poor man's grain, but that really undersold what barley meant to daily survival. It was the backbone of rural life, a true multitasker. If you were a farmer, a soldier, a monk, or just a hungry peasant, barley was in your bowl, your cup, or probably both. It grew in places where other grains simply gave up. Thin soils, rough climates, unpredictable seasons. Wheat might have been the snobby cousin, but barley was the reliable workhorse. And people knew it. It was everywhere. You'd grind it into flour for coarse bread, boil it for thick porridge that stuck to your ribs, or ferment it into ale. And let's be real. In the Middle Ages, beer wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Most water sources weren't exactly safe. Streams were contaminated, wells could carry disease, and boiling water for everything just wasn't practical. Brewing ale, on the other hand, naturally killed off bacteria during fermentation, making it one of the safest things to drink. It also had calories, carbs, and some nutrition. So when we say beer was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we're not joking. Adults often drank several liters a day. Even kids had their version, called small beer, with less alcohol, but still safer than water. That meant barley was doing double duty, feeding and hydrating everyone. It's no exaggeration to say people depended on it just to make it through the day. And it wasn't just about what you ate or drank. Barley was currency. It showed up in tax records, rent payments, and trade deals. Whole communities operated on barley-based economies. If you couldn't pay in coins, a few sacks of barley could settle your debts. It was also deeply tied to medieval warfare. Soldiers marched with sacks of barley, not just to eat as porridge, but to make hardtack, those infamous rock-solid biscuits that lasted forever. These things were so tough you had to soak them in liquid just to avoid breaking a tooth. But when you're far from home with no kitchen, they were better than nothing. Barley was also portable, lightweight, and didn't spoil easily. Armies loved it, and so did the breweries. In fact, brewing was often women's work in villages. Many women ran small-scale ale businesses, selling drink to locals before men took over brewing commercially centuries later. From the battlefield to the breakfast table, barley held its ground. It didn't just keep people alive, it helped them work, travel, build, and even fight. That's why calling it the MVP grain of the medieval world isn't an exaggeration. It was everything. Number 7, superfoods before it was cool. Long before Instagram health gurus and overpriced smoothie bowls, medieval people were surviving and thriving on a set of foods we'd now call superfoods, though they'd probably just call them dinner. We're talking about real tough crops that didn't need perfect soil or high-tech farming. They fed entire villages through brutal winters, failed harvests, and even plagues. What's wild is that many of these plants did more than just feed people. They actually made the land better too. That's not just food, that's survival engineering. Take fava beans, for example. While they were providing much needed protein in a mostly meatless diet, their roots were busy fixing nitrogen in the soil, making the land more fertile for the next crop. These beans didn't just fill bellies, they literally regenerated farmland. That's like eating a burger that also improves your backyard. Buckwheat worked a different kind of magic. It grew crazy fast, harvest ready in just 10 to 12 weeks, making it a perfect safety crop when others failed. Its dense root network stopped erosion and kept weeds in check. Plus, it released acids into the soil that made phosphorus more accessible to future plants. It was like having a natural fertilizer and weed killer built in. Medieval farmers might not have known the science, but they knew their crops grew better after buckwheat. That's field-tested knowledge passed down by watching what actually worked. Then there's emmer, the OG grain. This ancient wheat variety could survive on rocky, nutrient-poor soil and still produce consistent harvests. In a time when plowing was done with wooden tools and fertilizer was rare or non-existent, that kind of resilience was priceless. Emmer wasn't just rugged, it was packed with nutrients. More protein than modern wheat. Plus iron and magnesium. It didn't make light, fluffy bread, but it made dense loaves that stuck to your ribs and kept workers going through long, back-breaking days. Parsnips were another unsung hero. They didn't need much attention, and they got even better after the frost. Sweeter, more flavorful, and easier to store. Families could just leave them in the ground through winter and dig them up when they needed food. They were like a natural underground pantry. Plus, they were versatile. Roasted, mashed, baked into desserts. Imagine surviving winter with no fridge, no canned goods, and no supermarket, but knowing you had parsnips waiting in the frozen earth. Sweeter than ever. Barley might just be the most underrated of them all. It wasn't just turned into bread and porridge, it was the key to safe drinking. Medieval water sources were often contaminated, but beer made from barley was boiled during brewing, making it safe. That meant barley wasn't just food, it was hydration. People drank it daily, including kids, in a diluted form. On top of that, barley was calorie-dense and full of fiber. A pound of it could deliver more than 1,600 calories, essential in an age where people burned through energy just to stay alive. Then there's Good King Henry, the wild, leafy green that grew back year after year without fuss. It was packed with vitamins and minerals that were hard to come by in winter. Vitamin C to fight scurvy, iron for energy, calcium for bones. You didn't need to sow it each season. You just protected it and maybe scattered a few seeds. It was the kind of plant that knew how to survive, just like the people who depended on it. Now, centuries later, these crops are making a quiet return. Not because they're trendy, though they are, but because modern farming is facing challenges eerily similar to those of the medieval world. Climate instability, soil degradation, water scarcity. And it turns out these so-called forgotten plants are incredibly well suited to tough conditions. Small-scale farmers, organic growers, chefs looking for deeper flavors, they're all rediscovering the value of these crops. Emmer is showing up on fancy restaurant menus as farro. Brewers are experimenting with ancient barley strains. Buckwheat's making a comeback in gluten-free flours and traditional pancakes. Even parsnips are showing up roasted and drizzled in truffle oil. What's more, these foods actually taste like something. Earthy, rich, full-bodied. They weren't engineered for uniformity or shelf life. They were chosen for flavor and resilience. There's something deeply satisfying about eating the same food your ancestors once relied on. Not because it's nostalgic, but because it's practical, sustainable, and honestly better than most of what fills the middle aisles of a grocery store today. So yeah, these crops were superfoods before the word even existed. And maybe they're not just a blast from the past, but a blueprint for the future.